earlier in this story, we saw how the race to create the first video game console resulted in 3 systems with very different designs. In this episode, we'll learn how the Atari 2600 crushed its rivals, the Fairchild Channel F, and the Magnavox Odyssey 2. As we'll see, the effects of this battle still reverberate today. This is how the first video game war was won. Today, video game designers and programmers are the rock stars of their industry. They're interviewed by the press and mobbed at game expositions, and many gamers look forward to a particular developer's next game, the same way moviegoers look forward to the next films by their favorite actors and directors. In the early days of video games, though, programmers toiled in anonymity. Their names didn't appear on the game box or in the manual, and they often had no financial stake in the success of the games they created. This was the situation at Atari, but several of its best game programmers expected a change. They had a handshake agreement with founder Nolan Bushnell that they would receive billing for their individual games and a cut of their games' profits. But Bushnell left Atari before he could make good on that promise, having suffered through a rocky relationship with management at Warner Communications. His corporate-appointed replacement, Ray Kassar, had no intention of making sweetheart deals with his programmers. Kassar, who had previously managed a textile firm, told his programmers that they were no more important to him than the people who had designed his towels. Hearing this, 4 of Atari's best programmers, whose games accounted for half of Atari's cartridge sales, left to form a new company called ACTIVISION. This was the first instance of one company making games for another company's game console, or third-party development. Atari initiated a lawsuit that dragged on for years. Activision was ready for this. The company built new programming tools for game development to avoid relying on any software created at Atari, and set aside a percentage of revenues as a war chest to pay for legal fees. In the end, Activision prevailed. From the start, Activision games were excellent, often even better than the games the same programmers made at Atari. Either because Activision's game creators were now earning royalties, or because they wanted to show their old boss what he was missing, the first batch of Activision games set a new standard. No game better exemplifies what the Atari 2600 could do in the hands of gifted programmers than Pitfall. To understand how amazing Pitfall was at the time, one must remember the limitations of the Atari's hardware. As we saw previously, the Atari used small bitmaps called sprites for objects that moved around the screen. Each sprite had just one number in RAM that controlled the color of all of the foreground pixels. But Pitfall's protagonist, Pitfall Harry, had 4 colors, distinguishing his hair, head, shirt, and pants. To accomplish this, Harry's body positions were carefully designed as 4 horizontal bands, and the color of the sprite was changed during the appropriate intervals of each screen refresh. Through tricks like these, Activision games made the most of the console's capabilities. Although sales of Activision games didn't directly generate revenue for Atari, third-party development was a key to the console's success. Games like Pitfall lured more people into buying an Atari 2600, which earned Atari more money, and the more people who owned the console, the larger the market for every game maker. Activision's success encouraged other Atari programmers to form their own game development companies as well. The programmers who stayed behind at Atari were eventually given individual acknowledgement and challenged to improve their games, which they did, producing standout titles like Yar's Revenge, which, like Pitfall, pushed the limits of what the 2600 could do. Competition among game companies produced stronger results as programmers tried to outdo each other. Third-party development never occurred with the Fairchild Channel F. All 26 cartridges were produced in-house at Fairchild. Likewise, almost all of the Odyssey 2 titles were produced by Magnavox. Only 6 third-party games were made. The first of these, Demon Attack, didn't arrive on shelves until 1983, by which time the war was already tilted decisively in Atari's favor. The Magnavox equivalent of an Activision splinter group never happened because the bulk of Odyssey 2 games were the creation of one man, Ed Averitt, who was paid royalties on his games from the start. Atari also benefited from a clear focus on arcade-style games that were full of action. In contrast, Fairchild and Magnavox sought to produce a wider variety of cartridges for their consoles. The Channel F offered casino games such as blackjack and poker, puzzle games like Hangman, board games like checkers, and a cartridge for practicing arithmetic. The Odyssey 2 catalog included casino games and the computer intro cartridge that taught programming concepts. Magnavox even offered a special chess-playing expansion that included a second processor to boost the system's computational power. The Channel F and Odyssey 2 were aspiring to sophistication, to be more than mere toys, but most consumers just wanted straight-up action. Atari also licensed hit arcade games to make versions for their console, known as porting. Atari 2600 ports were graphically inferior to their arcade counterparts. Their version of Pac-Man, for example, was a severe downgrade from the arcade. Pac-Man didn't face up or down when he traveled in those directions, and the ghosts that chased him flickered terribly because the game didn't have enough sprites to display them all at once, so each ghost only appeared on every fourth frame of animation. But the game sold very well, and having Pac-Man made the Atari 2600 feel like the natural extension of the arcade experience. In comparison, Fairchild never licensed any games for the Channel F, and Magnavox only licensed a few lesser-known titles late in the console's lifetime. Magnavox did produce a few copycat games, including one called KC Munchkin that was clearly inspired by Pac-Man. In a reversal of what had happened with Pong, Atari sued Magnavox over the cloned game. Magnavox eventually agreed to replace KC Munchkin with the similar but not too similar KC's Crazy Chase. Both games were among the best Odyssey 2 titles, as Maze games perfectly matched the console's graphics hardware. But that made a difference only to the people who tried them. Most consumers simply knew that the Atari was the console with a huge game catalog that included many of the arcade's best-known games. The biggest reason for Atari's success, though, may have been its unwavering confidence in the commercial prospects of video games. Magnavox and Fairchild might have learned from Atari and emulated its success, but neither company possessed staying power in the industry. Both of Atari's competitors had been successful in other areas of electronics long before their entry into video games, and this seemed to limit their commitment to gaming. The Channel F was the very last product discussed in Fairchild's 1977 annual report, after such products as industrial instrumentation, flight data recorders, and LCD watches. Clearly, the Channel F was not a cornerstone of Fairchild's business plans. Magnavox management was also skeptical of the importance of gaming to their bottom line, and was always threatening to shut down that line of business. In 1974, when Magnavox was purchased by the Dutch electronics firm Philips, video games became an even smaller piece of the larger corporate pie. In contrast, video games were Atari's sole business, and when Warner Communications spent an estimated $30 million to buy Atari, the company was betting on the success of the Atari 2600. Atari's victory was the result of key decisions that turned out well, regardless of how wise they seemed at the time. The limitations of the 2600 hardware became a rewarding challenge for programmers, who found their hacker instincts stimulated by its primitive hardware. Throwing out its best programmers gave Atari the industry's best game catalog, and its competitors just didn't believe in gaming the way that Atari did. Although third-party development was important to Atari's victory, outside game development nearly killed the new industry. Dozens of game makers sprung up, hoping to replicate Activision's success, But many of these new developers didn't have the technical chops of earlier developers, nor their commitment to quality. Soon the marketplace was swamped with mediocre Atari 2600 games, and the price of games plummeted as retailers tried to move the glut of merchandise off their shelves. The bottom fell out so quickly that game cartridges became nearly worthless, as demonstrated by the failure of Atari's game adaptation of the hit movie E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The game so underperformed its sales expectations that Atari ended up burying truckloads of unsold cartridges in a landfill. Though the industry later recovered, the shakeout left the survivors bruised. Atari was sold by Warner and many times thereafter. Over the years, it developed a series of home computers that initially sold well but faded after the arrival of the IBM PC. They later introduced an advanced game console called the Jaguar and an early handheld game player called the Lynx, but they never reproduced the success of the original 2600. While the company still exists, at least in name, it hasn't been a significant force in decades. Fairchild had placed a smaller bet on gaming than Atari, but they too suffered financial reversals in the 1980s. Although Fairchild had patented much of the technology the semiconductor industry relied upon in the 1970s, as those patents expired, the company found itself outmaneuvered by its competition. The company was sold and broken up into pieces before being reconstituted as an independent company in 1997. Fairchild never worked in video gaming again. A few years after the last Odyssey 2 was sold, the Magnavox brand name was discontinued by parent company Philips. One of the last products marketed by the original Magnavox brand was a dedicated word processing computer called the Video Writer. Released in 1985, the Video Writer included a keyboard, a screen that displayed amber text on a black background, and a printer. It sold for $800, the equivalent of around $1,750 today. Activision was hit hard by the Atari market crash, but eventually bounced back and prospered, creating games for other consoles, personal computers, and mobile devices. In 2008, Activision merged with Blizzard, makers of the phenomenally popular online game World of Warcraft. The combined company remains one of the largest firms in the industry. Since leaving Atari, Nolan Bushnell has continued to work at the intersection of computing and entertainment. Among other projects, he helped create Chuck E. Cheese's, which combines video games, pizza, and animatronic character shows. Ralph Baer never stopped tinkering, continuing to invent toys and games even after his official retirement. One of these was Simon, a popular handheld electronic memory game by Milton Bradley. As befits the tit-for-tat nature of this war, Baer borrowed the basic game concept from an Atari arcade game called Touch Me. Baer's original brown box prototype of the Odyssey is now an exhibit at the Smithsonian. The lessons taught by the first video game war still shape the home gaming industry. Today, third-party development comprises the majority of games produced for video game consoles. Rather than fight third-party development, console makers encourage it, providing detailed technical specifications to outside developers. In return, third-party game makers pay a royalty to the console maker for each game unit sold. Because history has shown that games are what sell consoles, fostering third-party development is now a key part of every console's sales strategy. Especially important are the launch titles, the games that are released at the same time as the console. Console makers now partner with selected developers, providing assistance in development, marketing, and even direct financial support to ensure that the console's first games show the system in its best light. Despite the success of the Atari 2600 in focusing on pure game action, console makers have continued to market their systems as more than mere toys. When Microsoft released the Xbox One console in 2013, they chose the name to suggest that the console was the one and only box you needed to connect to your living room television. The Xbox One would not merely be your game system, Microsoft promised, but your complete entertainment provider, playing CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays, streaming video, digital music, and more. The system included the Kinect, a device which captures the movements and voices of people in the room. The wealth of features in the Xbox One was impressive, but it increased the cost of the system and divided consumers' attentions. The Xbox One's chief competition, Sony's PlayStation 4, focused squarely on gaming, with more rudimentary support of media. It doesn't even play music CDs. By the end of 2014, the PlayStation 4 was outselling the Xbox One by a 2-to-1 margin. Microsoft was forced to retreat from its concept of a universal entertainment box, introducing a new, cheaper version of the system that didn't include the Kinect. In 2017, Microsoft introduced a third version of the console, the Xbox One X, with greatly enhanced graphics capabilities. Microsoft's advertising for the new console version focused squarely on its game-playing ability. The media streaming capabilities of the system are no longer mentioned.